Your son said you signed everything over, Margaret, and he changed the locks this morning. Mrs. Harper's voice came through the phone thin and uncertain, like she wasn't sure she should have called at all, and for a moment I just stood there in the grocery store parking lot, my keys dangling from my fingers, the late afternoon sun glaring off the windshield of my old Buick as if the world had decided to become too bright all at once. That doesn't make any sense, I said quietly, more to myself than to her, because there are some sentences that simply don't belong in your life, some words that refuse to settle into reality no matter how clearly they're spoken, and this was one of them. My son Daniel had a key to my house, he didn't need to change the locks, and I had never signed anything over to anyone, not the house my husband and I had spent 32 years paying off, not the place where every wall held a memory I could still trace with my fingertips. I thought you should know, Mrs. Harper added gently. There was a man with him, a lawyer. I think they were inside for hours. I closed my eyes for a second, letting her words drift past me like something meant for someone else, someone with a different life, a different son. Thank you, I said finally, because politeness has a way of surviving even when everything else begins to crack. And when I hung up, I stayed there in the driver's seat a moment longer than usual, my hands resting on the steering wheel, not trembling, not yet, just still, as if my body hadn't quite caught up with the possibility that something had shifted while I was out buying milk and bread. Something quiet and permanent. I started the engine and pulled out onto Maple Street, the familiar route home unfolding in front of me in a way that felt almost staged. The same stop sign at the corner, the same oak tree shedding its early fall leaves across the sidewalk, the same row of houses that had once felt like a kind of comfort simply because they didn't change, and I remember thinking as I turned onto my street that whatever Mrs. Harper had seen, whatever she thought had happened, it would make sense the moment I pulled into my driveway. There would be an explanation. There always is. People misunderstand things, they assume too much, they see a fragment and build a story around it, and I was already preparing myself to laugh softly when I saw Daniel, to ask him what on earth he had been doing with a locksmith in the middle of a Thursday afternoon. But then I saw the front door and something inside me went very quiet. There was nothing dramatic about it. No broken glass, no signs of struggle, just a small, almost invisible difference that only someone who had lived there for decades would notice. The brass lock, the one my husband had installed himself on a rainy Saturday, was gone, replaced with something newer, shinier, colder. I parked the car slowly, turning off the engine with deliberate care, as if moving too quickly might somehow make it worse, and I sat there for a second, looking at the house, my house, the curtains still drawn the way I'd left them that morning, the flower pots still lined neatly along the porch, everything exactly as it should be, except for that lock. I reached for my keys, the same worn set I had carried for years, the edges smoothed by time and habit, and I stepped out of the car, the gravel crunching softly beneath my shoes, the air cooler than it had been earlier, or maybe that was just me noticing things differently now. I walked up the front steps, each one familiar, each one steady, and I remember thinking very clearly that this was the moment everything would return to normal, that I would slide the key into the lock, turn it, and the door would open the way it always had, simple, unquestioned, mine. But when I placed the key into the new lock, it didn't fit, not even close. I tried again, slower this time, as if patience could somehow reshape metal, but the result was the same. The key stopped short, useless, foreign. I stood there with my hand still on the doorknob, not pushing, not knocking, just holding it, as if the door might recognize me if I gave it a moment, as if 32 years meant something to wood and hinges and paint. And that was when the silence around me began to feel different, heavier, like the kind of silence that isn't empty but full of something waiting to be understood. I glanced over my shoulder and saw Mrs. Harper's curtain shift slightly across the street, just enough to let me know I wasn't alone in this moment, just enough to confirm that what she had said wasn't a misunderstanding, wasn't a mistake, and I felt something settle inside me then, not panic, not anger, but a slow, deliberate awareness that whatever had happened, it hadn't happened by accident. I looked back at the door, at the unfamiliar lock, at the place where my key no longer belonged, and I realized, with a clarity that left no room for doubt, that I hadn't just arrived home. I had arrived at the point where everything I thought I understood about my own life was about to be rewritten, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a single thought formed, quiet and steady: I should have seen this coming. I did not knock right away, because there are moments when your body understands something before your mind is willing to accept it, and standing there on my own front porch with a key that no longer worked felt like stepping into someone else's life without permission, so I simply stood still with my hand resting lightly against the door, as if I were a guest deciding whether I should even be there, and for the first time in years I realized I did not know what waited on the other side of that door. anymore. The air carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass from somewhere down the street, and a car passed slowly behind me, its tires whispering against the pavement. Everything ordinary, everything unchanged except for the one thing that mattered most. I finally lifted my hand and knocked softly, not because I needed to but because it felt like the right thing to do when approaching something that no longer belonged to you. There was a pause long enough for me to hear my own breathing, long enough for doubt to try one last time to convince me this was all a misunderstanding. And then I heard footsteps inside, not hurried, not uncertain, but steady and deliberate, the kind of footsteps that know exactly where they are going. The door opened and Daniel stood there looking at me, not surprised, not confused, just still, as if he had been expecting me all along. And for a moment I saw the boy he used to be, the one who used to run to this very door after school, dropping his backpack in the hallway and calling out for me before I could even turn around. But that memory did not stay long. It slipped away quietly, replaced by the man standing in front of me, now his expression calm, almost rehearsed. "Mom," he said, as if we were meeting for lunch, somewhere neutral, somewhere that did not carry the weight of everything behind us. "What is going on, Daniel?" I asked, my voice steady, because there is a certain dignity in refusing to let your voice break even when everything else feels like it might. He glanced briefly over his shoulder and then stepped aside just enough for me to see into the hallway, my hallway, except it did not look the same. There were boxes stacked neatly against the wall labeled in black marker, and the small table where I used to keep my keys and mail was gone, replaced by something I did not recognize. "We were going to call you," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that told me the call had never really been part of the plan. "We thought it would be easier this way." "Easier," I repeated quietly, tasting the word as if it might explain itself if I gave it enough time. "Mom, you cannot manage this house anymore," he continued, his tone measured, like someone explaining a decision that had already been finalized long before the conversation began. "It is too much for you, and we have been talking about what makes the most sense moving forward." I looked past him again, noticing the absence of things I knew should be there: the framed photo from our last Christmas, the coat I always left hanging by the door, small details missing like pieces of a puzzle that had been rearranged without me. "Who is we?" I asked, though I already knew the answer before he could say it. Ashley stepped into view, then her posture straight, her expression composed in that careful way she had perfected over the years. Polite but distant, like someone who had learned how to smile without ever truly softening her eyes. "Margaret," she said gently, as if she were greeting me at a social event instead of standing inside my home. "We have been trying to figure out the best solution for everyone." "Everyone," I repeated again, because it seemed to be the only word my mind could hold on to. "You signed the paperwork, remember?" Daniel added, and that was when something shifted, not outside, not in the house, but inside me, a small quiet movement like a door opening somewhere deep in my memory. "What paperwork?" I asked, and this time there was no confusion in my voice, only clarity. Because I knew the answer mattered more than anything. He hesitated just long enough to confirm what I already suspected before gesturing toward the dining room. "The transfer documents, the ones we went over a few weeks ago. You said you wanted things to be simpler." Simpler, the word echoed in my mind, and suddenly I could see at a kitchen table a stack of papers, Ashley's voice explaining things too quickly, Daniel reassuring me that it was just routine, something about making sure everything was organized in case anything happened. And I remembered how tired I had felt that afternoon, how I had trusted them because they were my family, because they had sat across from me in this same house with the same calm expressions telling me there was nothing to worry about. I looked back at the door, the new lock, the key still in my hand, and for the first time I understood that nothing about this had happened today. This had been set in motion long before Mrs. Harper picked up the phone, long before I stood in this driveway trying to make sense of a change that had already been carefully planned piece by piece. And I felt it then, not anger, not yet, but something colder, something steadier, the kind of realization that does not rush in all at once but settles quietly into place. I slipped my key back into my purse and looked at my son, not the boy I had raised, but the man who now stood between me and everything I had built. And I thought to myself with a clarity that surprised even me, this was not the moment I lost my home. This was the moment I began to understand exactly how it had been taken. I did not step inside even though the door was open. Because there is a difference between being invited into a space and being allowed to remain in it, and standing there on the threshold. I understood that difference more clearly than I ever had before. Daniel moved slightly as if to make room for me, but there was something in the gesture that felt practiced rather than genuine, like someone following through on a step they had already rehearsed. "You can come in if you want," he said, and the words sounded polite, but they carried no warmth, no sense of belonging, just a simple acknowledgement that I was standing outside a place I used to call home. I took a slow breath and walked in, not because I felt welcome but because I needed to see it for myself. The hallway felt narrower somehow, or maybe it was the boxes lined neatly along the walls that made it seem that way, each one labeled in careful handwriting: kitchen, living room, personal items. The words looked clinical, detached, like inventory, rather than pieces of a life. I paused beside one of them and ran my fingers lightly over the tape, sealing the top, noticing how firmly it had been pressed down, how final it felt. "We packed up most of your things," Ashley said from behind me, her voice calm, almost helpful, as if she were explaining something practical like organizing a closet. "We thought it would make the transition easier for you." Easier again, that word returned, as if repeating it enough times might turn this into something reasonable. I did not respond. I simply walked further into the house, my eyes moving from one detail to the next. The living room furniture had been rearranged, the couch angled differently, the coffee table replaced with something sleeker, less worn. The small lamp I used to keep by the window was gone, and in its place stood a tall modern fixture that cast a colder light across the room. Everything was familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, like a photograph that had been edited just enough to feel wrong without immediately revealing why. "Your room is upstairs, but we have already cleared most of it out," Daniel added, and I noticed the way he said your room, not bedroom, not our room, just your room, as if even the language had shifted to create distance between me and this place. I turned slowly, taking in the walls, the pictures that were no longer there, the spaces where memories had once been displayed openly, now reduced to empty patches of paint, and I realized then that this was not just about ownership, it was about erasure, a quiet, careful removal of everything that connected me to this house until all that remained was a structure that could be claimed without hesitation. "Where are my things?" I asked finally, my voice steady, not raised, not trembling, just clear. Daniel gestured toward the garage. "Most of it is out there. We figured you would want to go through it and decide what to keep." "Decide what to keep," I repeated in my mind, as if the choice itself were still mine, as if I had not already been excluded from the decisions that mattered. I walked toward the back of the house, each step measured, each breath controlled, because there is a certain power in refusing to rush when everything around you has already been set into motion without your consent. The door to the garage was slightly open, and when I pushed it further I saw rows of boxes stacked carefully from floor to ceiling, labeled with the same precise handwriting: personal documents, winter clothes, sentimental items. The word sentimental stood out to me because it suggested that someone had decided what was worth feeling, and what was not. I stepped inside, the cool air of the garage wrapping around me as I looked at the life I had built, reduced to cardboard and tape and labels that tried to organize something that could never truly be contained. I reached for one of the boxes marked documents and opened it slowly. Inside were folders neatly arranged, my name written across the tabs in ink that was not mine, and as I flipped through them I began to see the pattern: bank statements, insurance papers, copies of forms I vaguely remembered signing, each one placed carefully in order as if someone had been preparing for this moment long before I had any reason to suspect it. I closed the box gently and stood there for a moment longer, letting the silence settle around me, not empty but full of something I could not ignore anymore. When I turned back toward the house I caught a glimpse of Ashley watching me from the doorway, her expression unreadable, her posture relaxed, as if everything were unfolding exactly as expected, and in that moment I understood something that had been just out of reach until now. This was not just a decision they had made, this was a plan they had followed step by step, with patience, with intention, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from believing you have accounted for every possibility. I walked back toward them, my movements calm, my face composed, because whatever came next would not be decided in a moment of shock or confusion. It would be decided with the same careful precision they had used, and as I stepped into the hallway again I looked at Daniel, not with anger, not with disbelief, but with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding, and I thought to myself, they believed this was the end of something, but they had not yet realized it was only the beginning of what I was about to uncover. I walked back into the living room slowly, not because I needed more time to understand what was happening, but because I needed to remember what this space used to feel like before it was reduced to something transactional and controlled. And as I stood there I could almost see it layered over itself, the way it had been before: the worn armchair by the window where my husband used to sit every evening reading the newspaper, the soft hum of the old lamp casting a warm glow across the room, the quiet rhythm of a life built over decades, piece by piece, without shortcuts, without hidden intentions. And for a moment I allowed myself to stand in that memory, not to escape what was in front of me, but to measure the distance between what had been real and what was now being presented as reality. "We did not want to upset you," Daniel said from behind me, his voice careful, as if he were trying to place each word exactly where it would do the least damage. "We thought it would be better to handle everything first and then explain it once it was done." I turned to face him. Then noticing how easily he held my gaze, how steady he seemed, as if he had already walked through this conversation many times in his mind and reached the same conclusion. Each time, explain what exactly? I asked, because clarity has a way of exposing things that vague language tries to soften. Ashley stepped forward slightly, her expression composed, but there was something sharper beneath it, something precise. The house transfer, Margaret, the documents you signed gave Daniel full ownership. It is all legal, everything has been processed properly. Her tone was calm, almost reassuring, but it carried the quiet certainty of someone who believed the outcome could no longer be questioned. I nodded slowly, not in agreement but in acknowledgement, because there is a difference between hearing something and accepting it, and I was not ready to accept anything yet. Show me, I said simply. Daniel hesitated for a fraction of a second before gesturing toward the dining room. They are on the table, he said, and I followed him without another word, each step measured, each movement deliberate, because this was no longer about reacting, this was about understanding completely what had been done and how it had been done. The dining room looked different as well, the table cleared of the small details that once made it feel lived in. No placemats, no centerpiece, just a neat stack of papers arranged with almost deliberate symmetry, as if their order alone was meant to suggest legitimacy. I pulled out the chair and sat down, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table before reaching for the top document. The paper felt smooth beneath my fingers, the ink crisp, the signatures clear, and there it was, my name written in a hand that was unmistakably mine, Margaret Collins, signed neatly at the bottom of a page filled with legal language that now seemed far more specific than I remembered reading. I turned the page, then another, each one reinforcing the same conclusion: ownership transferred, rights reassigned, authority granted. The words repeated in different forms but always leading to the same result: Daniel Collins as sole owner of the property. I let the papers rest in my hands for a moment longer, not rushing to speak, not rushing to react, because the truth does not need to be met with noise to be understood, it only needs to be seen clearly. And as I sat there, I began to trace the memory, not in fragments but in sequence. The afternoon Ashley had come by with coffee, the way she had set the papers down, casually explaining that it was just part of organizing things, making sure everything was simplified in case anything happened. The way Daniel had nodded, reassuring me that it was routine, something many families did to avoid complications later. And I remembered how I had trusted that explanation, not because it made perfect sense but because it came from them, because it was easier to believe in good intentions than to question the people you love. You said you wanted things to be easier, Daniel repeated quietly, as if reminding me of my own words would somehow make the situation feel more acceptable. I looked up at him, then really looked at him, not as my son, not as the boy I had raised, but as the man who had made this decision, and I noticed something I had missed before: not guilt, not hesitation, but a kind of distance, as if he had already separated himself from the version of this story where I mattered in a different way. I said I wanted things to be simpler, I replied calmly. I did not say I wanted to give away my home. The distinction hung in the air between us, subtle but undeniable. Ashley shifted slightly, her composure tightening just enough to reveal that the conversation was no longer following the path she had expected. The documents are clear, Margaret, she said. Everything was explained. I nodded again, slowly placing the papers back on the table with care, aligning them exactly as they had been before, because there is a certain strength in handling things gently even when they have been used against you. Yes, I said quietly, they are very clear. And as I stood up from the table, I felt something settle into place inside me, not anger, not shock, but a steady understanding that clarity had replaced confusion, that the question was no longer what had happened but how it had been made to happen, and more importantly what had been overlooked in the process, because plans built on assumptions often leave something behind, something small, something unnoticed. And as I looked at the stack of documents one last time, I realized that whatever they believed they had secured with signatures and paperwork, they had also revealed something far more important without realizing it. And I thought to myself with quiet certainty, they believed the papers were the end of this story, but they had no idea they were only the beginning of mine. You can take anything you need today, Daniel said as I stood there beside the dining table, his voice steady, almost generous, as if he were offering me something instead of taking everything. And I turned my head slightly to look at him, not fully, just enough to acknowledge that I had heard him, because there is a certain kind of kindness that feels more like a transaction than a gesture. And I was beginning to recognize it more clearly with each passing moment. I will come back for my things later, I replied calmly. And even as I said it, I knew I would not be coming back in the way he expected, not as someone asking for permission, not as someone gathering what was left, but as someone who understood that what had been taken was far more than what could be packed into boxes. Ashley shifted her weight slightly beside him, her eyes watching me carefully, measuring my reaction. Perhaps waiting for something louder, something emotional, something that would confirm the version of me they had already prepared for. But I did not give it to her. Instead, I reached for my purse, adjusting the strap on my shoulder with the same deliberate care I had used when placing the documents back on the table, because control is not always about changing a situation. Sometimes it is simply about refusing to let the situation change you. "Where will you stay tonight?" Daniel asked, and for the first time, there was a faint hesitation in his voice, not concern, not exactly, but something closer to uncertainty, as if he had not fully considered that question before now, or perhaps had assumed the answer would be simpler than it actually was. I met his eyes, then holding his gaze just long enough to let the silence settle between us before answering. "I will manage," I said, and the words were quiet but complete, because I had spent a lifetime managing things, quietly solving problems without announcing them. And this would be no different. I turned toward the front door, walking through the hallway one last time, for now my eyes moving over the empty spaces, the missing photographs, the absence of everything that had once made this house feel like a place where I belonged. And I realized that what they had removed was not just objects but context. They had taken away the visible proof that I had ever been part of this space at all, leaving behind a version of the house that could be claimed without contradiction, without history, without me. I paused briefly at the door, my hand resting on the new lock, not trying to open it, not anymore, just feeling the cool surface beneath my fingers, as if to confirm that it was real, that this was not a misunderstanding that could be undone with a conversation or a simple explanation. And then I stepped outside, closing the door gently behind me, not slamming it, not making a scene, because endings do not always need noise to be final. Sometimes they arrive quietly, with a single decision to walk away without resistance, without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing you struggle. I walked down the front steps slowly, the late afternoon light stretching long shadows across the driveway, and for a moment I glanced across the street, catching a glimpse of Mrs. Harper standing by her window, her expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. But I did not wave, I did not stop to explain, because this was not something that could be explained in a few sentences, not something that could be softened into a story that made sense to anyone else. Not yet. I got into my car and sat there for a moment, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, just as they had earlier, but this time the stillness felt different, not like shock, not like disbelief, but like preparation, because understanding changes the way you move through a situation. It removes the urgency to react and replaces it with the clarity to act. And as I started the engine, I let my mind return to the details, not the emotion, not the betrayal, but the sequence, the papers, the timing, the way everything had been presented as routine, the way my trust had been used, not taken by force but guided carefully toward a conclusion that had already been decided without me. And I realized then that what they had relied on was not just my signature, but my assumption that they would never use it against me. They had counted on familiarity, on history, on the simple belief that family does not operate with hidden intentions, and in doing so they had overlooked something important, something they had not considered, because it did not fit into the version of me they had constructed in their minds. They had assumed I would accept this quietly, that I would step aside, that I would adjust my life around the decision they had made, as if it were inevitable, as if it were final. But assumptions are fragile things. They hold together only as long as they are not questioned. And as I drove away from the house, the one I had built, the one they now believed they owned, I felt that same quiet certainty settle deeper inside me, not anger, not regret, but awareness, because for the first time since Mrs. Harper's call, I was no longer trying to understand what had happened. I understood it completely, and what mattered now was something else entirely, not what they had taken, but what they had failed to notice in the process. And as I turned onto the main road, leaving the familiar street behind me, I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible breath of resolve, because whatever came next would not be decided by what they had planned, but by what they had overlooked. And I had a feeling it was something far more significant than they realized. I did not drive far before I knew exactly where I was going, because there are places you return to not out of habit but out of instinct, the kind of places that hold pieces of your life you once considered ordinary, until the moment you realize they might be the only things left untouched by what has just happened. And as I turned onto Oak Ridge Avenue, the street looked exactly as it always had, quiet, lined with trees that had stood longer than most of the houses around them. And I pulled into the parking lot of a small brick building I had not visited in months, the law office of Richard Lewis, the same man who had handled my husband's estate years ago, back when paperwork felt like a formality instead of a weapon. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, my hands resting in my lap, not because I was unsure, but because I was allowing the weight of this decision to settle fully before I stepped out of the car, because once you choose to stop reacting and start understanding, there is no going back to not knowing. I walked up the short path to the entrance, the glass door reflecting a version of me that looked exactly the same as it had that morning, and yet entirely different in ways that could not be seen. I opened the door and stepped inside, the familiar scent of paper and polished wood greeting me with a quiet consistency that felt almost grounding. Margaret, the receptionist said, looking up with a polite smile that softened slightly into recognition. It has been a while. I nodded, returning the smile briefly, because even now there was no need to rush, no need to explain everything all at once. Is Mr. Lewis available? I asked, and she hesitated only for a moment before picking up the phone, speaking in a low voice and then gesturing toward the hallway. He can see you now. I walked down the corridor, each step steady, each movement intentional. Because this was no longer about what had been done to me, it was about what I was about to uncover. Richard Lewis stood as I entered his office, his expression shifting from professional courtesy to something more attentive the moment he saw my face, not because I looked distressed, but because there is a certain kind of calm that signals something serious without needing to be stated. Margaret, it is good to see you, he said, gesturing for me to sit, and I did, placing my purse carefully beside my chair before looking at him directly. I need you to explain something to me, I said, and my voice was even, not urgent, not emotional, just clear, because clarity has a way of commanding attention without raising its volume. I reached into my bag and pulled out the single document I had taken with me, not the entire stack, just one page, the one that carried my signature, the one that had been used to justify everything that had happened. I placed it on his desk and slid it toward him. I signed this, I continued, but I do not remember signing what it actually does. He picked up the paper, adjusting his glasses slightly as he read, his expression unchanged at first, and then gradually more focused, the silence stretching between us, not uncomfortable but precise, as if each second was being used to measure something I had not yet fully identified. Where did you get this? He asked, finally looking up at me, and I met his gaze without hesitation. From my dining room table this afternoon, I replied, and I watched the moment the meaning settled in his eyes, not shock, not disbelief, but recognition, the kind that comes from seeing a pattern rather than a single event. And you say you do not recall the terms being explained in detail? He asked, and I shook my head slowly. I recall being told it was routine, that it would make things simpler, that it was for organization, not transfer of ownership. I paused briefly, letting the words settle before adding, I trusted them. He nodded once, placing the document back on the desk but not pushing it away, instead keeping his hand resting lightly on it, as if it were something that required careful consideration. Trust is often the foundation these things rely on, he said quietly, and there was no judgment in his tone, only observation. But documents like this are very specific, Margaret. They do not leave much room for interpretation. I leaned back slightly in my chair, not retreating but allowing space for the next part of the conversation, because this was where understanding would either confirm what had been done or reveal something else entirely. Then explain it to me, I said. Explain exactly what this document does, and more importantly, what it does not do. And as he looked down at the paper again, I felt that same steady awareness settle deeper inside me, because whatever answer he was about to give would not change what had already happened, but it would determine something far more important: what had been missed, what had been assumed, and whether the plan that had been carried out so carefully had truly accounted for everything, or if somewhere within these pages there was something they had overlooked, something small, something precise, something that had not been considered. And as I waited for him to speak, I realized that for the first time since this began, I was no longer looking backward at what had been taken, I was looking forward at what might still be mine in ways they had never anticipated. Richard did not answer immediately, and that told me more than if he had spoken right away, because hesitation in a man like him was never about uncertainty, it was about precision, about choosing exactly how to explain something that carried more weight than the words themselves. He adjusted the document slightly on his desk, aligning it with the edge as if the position of the paper mattered, before he finally looked up at me. Margaret, this document does transfer ownership of the property to Daniel, he said calmly, and I nodded once, not because I agreed but because I had already accepted that part. The truth does not become less real just because you resist it, however, he continued, and that single word settled into the room with a quiet significance that made everything else fall still. It is not a complete transfer in the way they might believe. I did not move, I did not interrupt, I simply held his gaze, because when clarity begins to form, the only mistake is rushing it. What do you mean? I asked, and my voice remained steady, because whatever this was, it required understanding, not reaction. He tapped the paper lightly with his finger. This document gives Daniel legal title to the property, yes, but it does not override the trust your husband established before he passed. And for a moment the room seemed to shift, not dramatically, not suddenly, but just enough for something that had been obscured to come back into focus. The trust, I repeated quietly, and I felt the memory return, not as a vague impression, but as something precise. The afternoon my husband had insisted on meeting with Richard, the way he had explained that it was not about what we owned, but about how it would be protected long after we were gone or unable to manage it ourselves. Yes, Richard said. Your husband placed the house under a living trust with specific conditions, Margaret, conditions that cannot be bypassed by a standard transfer document unless those conditions are formally addressed and met. I sat back slightly in my chair, letting that settle, because it was not a contradiction of what had happened, but it was not confirmation of their control either. It was something else, something they had not accounted for. And those conditions, I said carefully, what are they? He opened a drawer and pulled out another file, thicker, older, the edges slightly worn from time rather than recent handling, and he placed it on the desk beside the transfer document, opening it with the same measured care. The trust stipulates that while ownership may be reassigned, the right of residence remains with you for the duration of your lifetime unless you voluntarily relinquish it under clear and informed consent. He paused briefly before adding, and based on what you have told me today, that consent may be questionable. I felt something shift again, not relief, not yet, but alignment, the kind that comes when pieces that did not fit begin to form a pattern. So they cannot remove me? I asked, and he did not answer immediately. Instead, he chose his words with the same precision he had shown from the beginning. They can attempt to, Margaret, but legally it would not hold if challenged, especially if it can be demonstrated that the nature of the document was misrepresented at the time of signing. I nodded slowly, because this was not about reclaiming something instantly. This was about understanding the structure beneath what had been done. The foundation they had assumed was solid without ever checking what it was built on. And the locks, I said, changing them does not change the terms of the trust. He replied simply, and there was no emphasis in his voice, no need for it. The fact itself was enough. I looked down at the two documents side by side, the transfer paper clean, recent, precise, and the trust older, deeper, layered with intention that extended beyond a single moment, and I understood then the difference between them. One was immediate, visible, designed to create the appearance of finality. The other was enduring, quiet, designed to hold its ground regardless of what was placed on top of it. They believe this is finished, I said, more to myself than to him, and Richard gave a small nod. That would be a reasonable assumption if they were unaware of the trust's full implications. I let out a slow breath, not of relief but of recognition, because this was not a reversal. This was an opening, a space that had been left unguarded, not out of carelessness but out of assumption. They had followed a plan, they had executed it carefully, but they had done so within a framework they did not fully understand, and that was where their certainty began to weaken. What do I need to do? I asked finally, and this time there was no hesitation in my voice, no uncertainty, just direction, because the moment you understand the structure you no longer move blindly within it. Richard closed the file, gently placing his hand on top of it as if to anchor the conversation in something solid. You do not confront them yet, he said. You gather everything you remember, every document, every interaction, and you allow them to continue believing they are secure. He met my eyes, then his expression steady but firm. Because, Margaret, the moment they realize what they have overlooked, they will try to correct it, and right now their greatest weakness is that they do not know there is one. I nodded once more, and as I stood up from the chair I felt that same quiet certainty return, not louder, not heavier, but clearer, because this was no longer about loss, it was about position, about timing, about understanding exactly where the line had been drawn and where it could be challenged. And as I reached for my purse, I realized something that had not been obvious before. They had changed the locks, they had taken the house, they had believed they had closed the door on me. But what they had actually done was step into a situation they did not fully control, and they had done it with complete confidence, which made what came next not just possible but inevitable. I left Richard's office without rushing, because when a path becomes clear, there is no need to move quickly, only correctly. And as I stepped outside, the evening air felt different, not lighter, not easier, but more defined, as if the world itself had shifted into sharper focus. Now that I understood where I stood within it, I walked to my car and sat behind the wheel for a moment, my hands resting calmly as I replayed every detail, not the emotions, not the betrayal, but the sequence, the timing, the language they had used, the confidence in Daniel's voice, the precision in Ashley's explanations, the careful way everything had been presented as routine. And I realized that what they had built depended entirely on one thing: my silence. Not just my silence in that moment, but the kind of silence that accepts what is placed in front of it without question, the kind of silence they believed would continue because it always had. And as I started the engine, I understood that I would not break that pattern, not yet. I would let it remain exactly as they expected, because expectation is the most effective place to hide a change. I drove to a small extended stay hotel on the edge of town, the kind of place people overlook because it does not draw attention to itself, and that was exactly what I needed: a place that allowed me to exist without explanation, without questions, without the subtle pressure of being observed. I checked in quietly, giving my name without hesitation, because there was nothing to hide, only something to prepare. and when I entered the room I placed my purse on the small desk and stood there for a moment taking in the simplicity of the space, a bed, a lamp, a window that looked out onto a parking lot. Nothing personal, nothing permanent, and yet it felt more stable than the house I had just left, because this space had no illusions attached to it. It was exactly what it appeared to be. I sat down and opened my purse, pulling out the document again, not to reread it, but to study it differently this time, not as something done to me, but as something that revealed how it had been done. I traced my signature with my eyes, noting the date, the formatting, the placement of each clause, and I began to reconstruct the conversation that had led to it, the way Ashley had positioned the paper slightly angled toward me, the way Daniel had remained quiet just long enough to make her explanation seem uninterrupted, the way I had signed not because I was convinced but because I was not given a reason to doubt. And I realized then that what they had relied on was not deception in the obvious sense, but in the subtle one, the kind that does not introduce false information but rearranges the truth just enough to guide you toward a conclusion that benefits someone else. I reached for my phone and scrolled through my recent messages, not searching for anything specific at first, just allowing the pattern to reveal itself. And there it was, messages from Ashley, spaced carefully over the past few weeks, checking in, offering to help, mentioning paperwork in passing, never urgent, never detailed, just enough to create familiarity, just enough to make the moment of signing feel like a continuation rather than a decision. And I felt a quiet acknowledgement settle in, because this had not been rushed, it had been built slowly, intentionally, step by step, until the final action felt almost inevitable. I set the phone down and leaned back in the chair, my mind moving not backward anymore, but forward, because understanding the past only matters if it informs what comes next, and what came next would not be driven by reaction, it would be guided by timing, by allowing them to continue exactly as they were, believing exactly what they believed, because the moment they sensed resistance they would adjust, they would close the gaps, they would protect the parts of the plan that had been left exposed, and right now those gaps were still open. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dim parking lot, the faint glow of streetlights reflecting off windshields, and I thought about the house, the one they believed was now theirs, the one they had already begun to reshape to fit a version of the story where I no longer existed. And I realized something that had not been obvious before: they had moved quickly to secure the surface, the locks, the documents, the visible signs of ownership, but they had not secured the structure beneath it, the trust, the conditions, the legal framework that still held everything in place regardless of what had been changed on the outside. And that was where the shift would happen, not loudly, not suddenly, but precisely. I returned to the desk and took out a small notebook, writing down everything I could remember, every conversation, every detail, every moment that had seemed insignificant at the time but now carried weight, because in situations like this the smallest detail can become the strongest point of clarity. And as I wrote I felt that same steady control return, not over the situation itself but over my place within it, because control is not about stopping what has already happened, it is about understanding exactly where it can still be influenced. And as I closed the notebook I allowed myself a single quiet thought, not of revenge, not of anger, but of certainty. They believed they had taken something from me, something final, something irreversible, but what they had actually done was reveal exactly how they operated, exactly what they assumed, exactly where they were vulnerable. And as I turned off the light and sat in the stillness of the room, I understood that the next step would not come from confronting them, it would come from allowing them to continue until the moment arrived when what they believed to be secure would begin to unravel on its own. I woke before the sun had fully risen, not because I had slept well, but because my mind had already moved ahead to what needed to be done. And for a moment I lay still in the unfamiliar quiet of the room, the ceiling above me plain, unmarked, without history. And I realized that for the first time in years I was not waking into a routine that had been shaped by others, I was waking into something that required intention and clarity. And I sat up slowly, reaching for my phone, not to check messages but to confirm what I already expected. There were 2 missed calls from Daniel, and a short message sent late the night before. "Mom, we need to talk about next steps." I read it once, then set the phone down without responding, because there is a difference between urgency and importance. And I was no longer willing to confuse the two. I dressed simply the same way I always had, nothing dramatic, nothing that suggested anything had changed, because on the surface nothing had to change yet. I left the room and drove back toward the house, not quickly, not cautiously, just steadily following the same route as before, but this time with a different understanding of where I stood within it. When I turned onto the street, everything looked the same as it had the day before, the same houses, the same quiet order, the same sense of normalcy that made what had happened feel almost invisible from the outside. I parked across the street, not in the driveway, not yet, and I sat there for a moment watching the front of the house, the curtains slightly different now, the door opening and closing as Daniel stepped out, speaking on his phone, his posture relaxed, his movements unhurried, as if He had already settled into the role he believed was now his, and I watched him without emotion, not because I felt nothing but because what I felt no longer needed to be expressed in that way. I stepped out of the car and walked across the street, my pace, even my expression, composed, and when he noticed me he ended his call quickly, his face shifting into something that resembled concern but did not quite reach his eyes. "Mom, I was going to call you again," he said, and I nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without engaging with it. "I know," I replied calmly, and I continued walking past him up the front steps, not stopping, not asking, because this was not a request, this was a return. And when I reached the door I did not reach for my key, I simply placed my hand against it, waiting, and after a brief pause he moved forward, unlocking it from the inside, the new mechanism clicking open with a sound that no longer felt final, and I stepped inside without hesitation. The air inside the house felt the same as it always had, but the difference was no longer in the space, it was in the understanding of it. I turned to face him, then Ashley appearing behind him, her expression alert, her posture slightly more rigid than before, as if something in my presence had disrupted the balance they had expected. "We need to discuss how this is going to work moving forward," Daniel began, his tone measured but carrying an undercurrent of assumption, and I listened without interrupting, because sometimes the most important thing is not what is said but how it is said. "You can stay here for a few days while you figure things out, but after that we think it would be best if you transition somewhere more suitable." Suitable, the word echoed faintly, but it did not hold the same weight anymore, because I understood now that their words were built on a foundation they did not fully control. I looked at both of them, then my gaze steady, my voice calm, not raised, not sharpened, just clear. "I am not going anywhere," I said, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to shift the room in a way that no argument could have. Ashley's expression tightened slightly, Daniel's posture stiffened just enough to reveal that this was not the response they had prepared for. "Mom, we already went over this, the house is in my name now," he said, and there was a trace of insistence in his voice, not confidence, not certainty, but something closer to repetition, as if saying it again would reinforce its truth. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without conceding to it. "Yes, the title is in your name," I replied evenly, "but the right to live here is still mine." The silence that followed was immediate, not empty, but charged with the realization that something had entered the conversation that they had not anticipated. "What are you talking about?" Ashley asked, her voice controlled but sharper now, and I met her gaze without hesitation. "The trust," I said simply, and I watched as the words settled between them, not fully understood, not yet, but recognized as something that existed beyond the documents they had relied on. "The house was placed under a living trust years ago. It includes conditions that were never removed, and those conditions give me the right to remain here for the rest of my life." Daniel shook his head slightly, as if rejecting the information on instinct rather than understanding. "That is not what the paperwork says," he replied quickly, and I allowed a small pause before answering, not to create tension but to let the clarity of what I was about to say stand on its own. "That is because you were looking at the wrong paperwork," I said quietly, and in that moment I saw it, the shift. The subtle but undeniable change in their expressions, the confidence that had been so carefully constructed beginning to fracture, not dramatically, not all at once, but just enough to reveal the uncertainty beneath it. And I did not press further, I did not explain everything, I simply stood there allowing the weight of what had been said to settle, because the most effective change does not come from overwhelming someone with information, it comes from introducing a single truth that cannot be easily dismissed. And as I turned slightly, walking further into the house, not as a guest, not as someone asking for space, but as someone who understood exactly where she stood, I realized that this was the moment everything had shifted, not when they changed the locks, not when they presented the documents, but now in the quiet recognition that what they believed to be complete was in fact incomplete. And as I moved through the space that had once been taken from me, I allowed myself one final thought, not spoken, not expressed, but certain. They thought they had closed the door on me, but all they had done was lock themselves inside something they did not fully understand.